Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 101. Find Your Footing. Toshinori was sure that one day he would stop being surprised by Midoriya's skills, but today was not that day. He listened as he expertly devised a plan and instructed his teammate, doing his best to play to the strengths and weaknesses he knew about everyone involved. Everything was going according to Midoriya's plan until he ran into the enemy team. He was surprised he hadn't heard Midoriya talk about his childhood friend, or whom he assumed must be a childhood friend, seeing as though he referred to him as Kachan. He recognized him as the kid who Midoriya had saved from the sludge villain on the day they had first met, but he'd not spoken of him since then. The situation only became more confusing as the minutes ticked by. Bakugo lunged at Midoriya with blind fury, and Toshinori wasn't sure how much of that could be excused by him playing a part. He was prepared to step in if things got out of hand, but he wasn't prepared for just how quickly the situation would devolve. Bakugo pulled the pin on his gauntlet and aimed straight for Midoriya's head before Toshinori could say a word. The camera they were watching the fight through cut to black after the explosion whited out the contrast completely. He would have been gone in a millisecond if he hadn't seen his protege rolling to a hard stop against the far wall on another monitor with the other student firmly in his grasp. The camera's position gave him a clear view of the carnage that the blast had caused, and it made Toshinori sick. That would have killed his boy, if not Bakugo as well. Midoriya, is everyone all right? He asked over the intercom, but Midoriya didn't seem to hear him. Even if he did hear him, he was too busy subduing the other boy who was still trying to fight. He answered his question well enough by getting up and throwing his friend to the ground before stripping him of his weapons. Toshinori took a subtle, deep breath at that. He was well enough to continue the exercise. He should be fine. He watched with bated breath as Midoriya threw himself backward through a window 4 floors above street level and secured the weapon with the help of his teammate. Once all was said and done, he was all too relieved to announce that the hero team had won. His relief didn't last long as his announcement roused the student who'd been terrorizing his protege, and he immediately flew back into a fury, effortlessly ripping his hands out of the flimsy capture tape they'd been bound in, and stalking toward the room where Midoriya and the rest of his students in the exercise were. For a moment, his panic spiked, and he pictured another one of those explosions going off in a room where 3 of his students were. The thought chilled him to the bone. Young Bakugo, stand down. The exercise is over, he commanded over the intercom with more force than he had ever used with a child. Generally, he did his best to be as non-threatening as possible to civilians and allies. He knew he could be intimidating, but he never wanted people to be afraid of him. Right now, that concern was the farthest thing from his mind, as the blonde thankfully heeded his command and stopped in his tracks. If his heart rate skyrocketed this high every time he saw Midoriya fight, he's not sure how much more he could take before he expired from a heart attack. The entrance exam, and now this? Good gosh, Shugenji was right. This kid was a trouble magnet. Report back to the observation room, he instructed the 4 students not already here with him before returning his attention back to the remaining 16 who were all staring at him with wide eyes. Great. He'd frightened all of them. He tried to reassure them with a softer and kinder smile than he usually wore, and he saw some of them release the tension in their expressions. But not all of them. He bit back a sigh as he waited for the last 4 students to join them. His heart rate settled as Midoriya slipped through the door behind everyone else and stood next to his teammate off to the side of the room. All right, everyone. Who can tell me who the MVP of that fight was? He asked the class to start their post-battle debrief. One of the girls in the group stepped forward with her hand raised and waited for him to nod before speaking. Midoriya had clear communication with his teammate throughout, devised a solid plan, and followed through with it despite running into disaster. Not only that, he ensured the safety of both himself and his opponent. Ida did everything he could given the circumstances. He embodied the role and took the practice seriously, but there's only so far you can get with an uncooperative team member. Uraraka did as instructed by her teammate, but took no initiative on her own. Even if that was the best play in this instance, she wasn't given the opportunity to prove herself. Bakugo launched a large-scale attack indoors, damaged his own base, and refused to work with his partner, all because of a personal grudge. Therefore, Midoriya was the most valuable player in the mission. Though the title could just as easily go to Ida, history is written by the victors. The student who had introduced herself as Yayorozu stated matter-of-factly. Toshinori was impressed. She stated everything elegantly and succinctly, leaving no stone unturned. Precisely, young Yayorozu. Excellent analysis, he praised. A light blush bloomed on her cheeks, but Midoriya was beet red and staring at her wide-eyed. His gaze flicked to Bakugo for a moment before settling on Toshinori himself. Midoriya did an excellent job leading his team, and Ida took his role very seriously. Even 2 versus 1, he had them down to the wire. Communication is vital when working as a team, and the results of this exercise show that. I expect the rest of you to learn from their mistakes going forward. The next matchup is between Team B as the heroes versus Team I as the villains, he declared. He relaxed further as he got a round of enthusiastic yes sirs from the class, and Midoriya settled in the front corner of the room to his right, while Bakugo stayed in the far back corner to the left. This had to be the worst of the exercises, he told himself, taking another subtle deep breath as he turned back to the monitors and kept Midoriya in his periphery. Today was strange. It was good, and that was the odd part. Ida and Uraraka stayed by his side for the rest of class and chatted amicably whenever the atmosphere allowed for it. Even though he didn't say much, they still insisted on walking to the train station with him. Ida had boarded a different train, but Uraraka was headed northbound with him. That exercise was crazy, wasn't it? Mina said that All Might totally dug into Bakugo at the end. She said he was gunning for you again before All Might yelled at him. Uraraka idly chatted as they sat next to each other. Izuku's face blanched at that. All Might yelled at Kacchan? Kami, he was getting into so much trouble because of Izuku. What's his problem with you anyway? She asked. Oh, Kacchan, he's just competitive, he tried to assuage. That went a little past competitive, if you ask me. There was a hole in the side of the building, she exclaimed before adding, Did he aim that at you? I'm fine. I can handle myself, he insisted. He did, didn't he? Uraraka gathered with an angry look on her face. That's not okay, Midoriya. You could have died. But I didn't. I'm fine. That's not the point. What if you didn't dodge? What if he took the whole building down? She pushed. He just didn't know how powerful the blast would be. It was the support gear he has. It's new. He just doesn't know how to use it yet. Well, then he shouldn't have used it, Uraraka insisted. He didn't have an argument for that. She was right. He knew she was right. Kacchan shouldn't have done what he did. Izuku just hoped he wouldn't get in trouble because of it. For the rest of the train ride, their conversation was stilted and awkward. Uraraka got off a few stops before he did, and it occurred to him too late that he should have probably gotten off at the stop that took him to his old apartment for appearance's sake. But what was done was done. So he just hoped that Uraraka didn't know the city well enough to know that nowhere past that train stop was a place she wanted to be. Actually, no, that wouldn't be better. He should probably tell her not to venture too far north. He could do that tomorrow and get off at a different stop. If she asked, he could tell her he needed to pick something up from somewhere on the north side or something. The train screeched to a stop at the end of the line and he got out, keeping an eye on his surroundings. The streets had been much more habitable since they took down the Yakudo, but they could hardly be considered nice. That point was driven home succinctly as he was roughly pulled into a blind alley. He wrenched himself out of his attacker's grasp and prepared himself for a fight until he saw who had grabbed him. It was the burned man that he had started seeing around town a few months ago. This guy had saved him from some creep following him the first time they had met, so he wasn't scared of him despite the circumstances. So you've got the reflexes to match the getup, do you? The man asked with a smirk. What do you want? He asked sternly. He wasn't really threatened at the moment, but he didn't want to give off the impression that he was a big enough pushover to let a stunt like that slide. You're a walking target, dumbass. The man responded cryptically. Panic rose in his chest at the comment, but he did his best not to let it show on his face. There was no way this guy knew he was Ivy, right? He'd been careful. He made certain that no one followed him home after patrol, and he only came and went in his gear under the cover of night. This man had a fire quirk, not night vision. He knew he had set up camp in the warehouse district, but as far as Izuku knew, that was several blocks away from his own residence. Izuku raised his brow at the man, wordlessly asking him to elaborate. If he didn't know anything, Izuku wasn't going to be stupid enough to let something slip. The uniform, idiot. You're practically begging to get mugged. This is the second day in a row, and I'm not going to keep watching your back for you. Get a damn hoodie, or at least take the jacket off. Izuku couldn't help the relieved laugh he let out at that. Ha! I don't think anyone mugging me is going to get much out of it, he scoffed. Yeah, well, the uniform begs to differ. You go to a rich kid's school, they're going to assume you're a rich kid, he rebutted. Now get lost. I don't need to be seen mingling with Uptown's elite, he quipped sarcastically. Izuku shrugged the jacket off and rolled his eyes at that. I'll try not to ruin your bad boy reputation, he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder again. The man raised an eyebrow at the sass, but thankfully he didn't seem angry. He was acting too much like Ivy now. He needed to cool it. Thanks. I put a lot of work into it, he shot back dryly as he gestured for him to get lost. Izuku gave him a grateful nod and went on his way. He ditched the poor excuse for a tie as he made his way back to the brewery, keeping an eye out to make sure the man wasn't still watching his back. He may not feel overly threatened by him, but he sure as hell didn't trust him. However, he didn't trust anyone, so that didn't really say much. In hindsight, he can't believe he overlooked that. Wearing a UA uniform in Uptown sounded like a great way to get mugged. It's not like he couldn't handle himself, but he'd rather avoid an altercation entirely if he could help it. Did that man follow him home yesterday? He really hoped he didn't. He did not want to deal with packing up shop again. Following a stranger all the way from the train station to here was a hell of a lot of work for no payoff anyway. It was a solid 10 to 15-minute walk, depending on how quickly he was walking, and he couldn't imagine that the guy was that committed to his well-being. He'd stay for now, but he'd keep an eye out. The guy had been all bark and no bite so far, and he clearly didn't have the intention of hurting him. If he wanted to, yesterday would have been a prime opportunity. When he got back, he made sure to lock the door behind him. He needed to rest before patrol, and he felt too on edge to sleep without the extra assurance a locked door provided. After lying down on the couch for a few minutes, he got up and shoved the desk in front of the door as well. This wasn't going to work, was it? His paranoia was satiated for the time being, but the desk was not a long-term solution. He would figure that out later. Right now, he needed to sleep. He managed to catch a fitful few hours of sleep before his alarm woke him at 7:15. With a groan, he turned it off and got up. He had homework to do and a dinner to pack before he got ready for patrol, and he only left himself 2.5 hours. The door and desk were both still firmly in the places he had left them, which calmed his nerves a bit. Eraser and ectoplasm didn't hold off on their assignments, but the rest wasn't too bad. English was a breeze, and he managed to finish everything due tomorrow in just under 2 hours. He had already prepared the week's worth of dinners last Sunday, so he just added some of the rice and chicken he made in with the leftovers he had from lunch. He had an idea as he was falling asleep, so he geared up and readied himself to go a solid 10 minutes earlier than he usually did and headed to the main floor of the warehouse. There was a huge flammables cabinet on the west wall. It was empty. He'd poked around it a while ago, but it was durable and heavy, and most importantly, bigger than the door to his office. He'd have to use one for all to move it, meaning that the average person wouldn't be able to move it at all. And it was fireproof. If that guy followed him home, he'd both have to know where to find the room Izuku had set up in and figure out a way to move the massive fireproof cabinet in order to get to it. Was he being a little over paranoid? Yes, he probably was. But he was better off safe than sorry. With his mind at ease, he set off into the night, making sure to stay almost completely hidden until he crossed out of the warehouse district entirely. It felt like they hadn't been out like this for ages. They reveled in the breeze against their face as they ran across the rooftops on their way to meet Eraser. They did their best to push any anxieties aside and fall into Ivy entirely. This wasn't about UA or Izuku. This was about Ivy. And this was about Uptown. They had a duty to this place, and they couldn't let their personal life infringe on that any more than it already was. Evening, Eraser. They greeted as Aizawa joined them on the rooftop. He just grunted in response before plopping down on the ledge with them. Day going that well for you? They asked sardonically. This class is a nightmare, he responded. They did their best to not let themselves react to that. Kids, huh? They replied awkwardly. The first full day, and they blew up a damn building. He continued as he rubbed at his eyes in exasperation. Yeesh, they forced out, trying not to sound guilty. Eraser hummed in agreement as he opened his bento. They let their gaze linger on him longer than they usually would before turning around and opening their own dinner. He was going to miss this, being Ivy. End of chapter.